Welcome to Module 12. This week we're going to be discussing effective teaching for students with emotional and behavioral disorders. I hope everyone is doing well. We only have about 3 more weeks left, so we're winding down into our last couple chapters and your final IEP assignments. So I do welcome you to reach out if you have any questions or concerns as we wrap up with our semester. So our mini lecture goals for today are to do a quick review of Module 11, to talk through some effective teaching strategies for students with emotional and behavioral disorders, and then we'll have a wrap up for this module. So as you remember from last week, we talked about considerations that you should keep in mind when addressing problem behavior and how to respond to those behaviors in your classroom. So this is a slide from our last module that should help you to review some of those things. So remembering that you as a teacher you all have an ethical and a professional obligation to use evidence-based strategies and supports. And we'll be talking through more of those supports as we go through this module and this lecture. You also want to remember that your intervention should have social validity, both for you, your students, most importantly your students, but also for their family members. You want to make sure that the interventions that you are implementing are not only effective and evidence-based, but that they are socially valid or have some useful or usable importance to your students. Okay? And we want to remember that there are some behavior enhancement interventions that increase behavior. So, and when you catch your students being good, right, and you want to increase those behaviors, what are some strategies that you can use in those instances? And then you want to be able to review, define, and describe behavior and reduction interventions that you would like to implement or that are evidence-based strategies for reducing problem behaviors. So having completed Module 11, you should not only be able to identify those considerations for addressing problem behavior, but also be able to identify both behavior enhancement interventions and behavior reduction interventions. So if you feel like you're still a little murky on those, be sure to go back and revisit Module 11. And you can also go back to Module 4, I believe, where we talked about more applied behavior analysis strategies to get some in-depth information about how to implement those strategies as well. So this week we're going to talk more about effective teaching strategies for students with EBD, and it's probably one of the most contentious topics as it relates to supporting students with EBD in the classroom, because so often teachers spend lots of their time combating behaviors, and it often seems like the effective teaching, the implementation of effective pedagogy is often overlooked. So in this slide, you kind of see a breakdown of where students with emotional behavioral disorders are served. And you can see that more than 60% of their time, that 33% of the students in this sample across students with emotional behavioral disorders, 60% of them spend their time outside of the regular classroom. So more than about 33% of students spend more than 60% of their time outside of the regular general education classroom. And then you also see that about 23% of these students spend anywhere between 21 and 60% of their time outside of the regular classroom. And then 25.5% of them spend 21% or less of their time outside of the regular classroom. And then you also see that 13.5% of these students are served in separate facilities, so behavioral facilities. Oftentimes we call them what we call level 5 psychiatric facilities. That was actually one of my first jobs out of undergrad, and we served a huge population of students with emotional behavioral disorders in a separate facility. And it really brings to this point about effective teaching, because this particular facility was supposed to be also providing educational supports and schooling on an everyday basis, but the staff were so often just combating behaviors, trying to learn how to manage behaviors, that the students really weren't gaining any educational benefits. That was many years ago, so since then I've learned that the school part of this facility is now accredited, and they have a team of well-trained teachers who are now able to implement effective teaching strategies, but it definitely takes a team of support, of teachers who are, really trained and able to manage both behaviors and implement effective teaching strategies. So you see those separate facilities, and then you also have residential facilities where students live, and then finally home and hospital. So you can tell that many of our students with emotional and behavioral disorders are not served in the general education classroom, definitely not for all of their day. Some of them are spending parts of their days in the gen ed, but many of them are receiving their supports outside of the gen ed, and so that lends itself to it points to the importance for us as as special educators, to really work collaboratively with general educators, with related service providers to meet the needs of students with EBD. It's Monday. I guess I'm not quite with it yet. Sorry. My words are getting tied up. So, do teachers of students with EBD use effective instructional strategies? The short answer to that is no, really. You see at the beginning of your chapter 12 this week that the authors talk about how sometimes teachers neglect the academics just because they're trying to manage behavior, and it's quite overwhelming in many cases. There's also little systematic instruction in classrooms for students with emotional and behavioral disorders. And then in teacher preparation programs, there's often an emphasis on behavior more so than academic instruction. And it's kind of a catch-22 because one of the things that we hear most in terms of special education teacher specifically, attrition in the field, is that teachers leave the field or leave the classroom because of student behavior or behavior problems or challenging behavior. And so there's always this tricky balance between supporting pre-service educators or in-service educators if you're back for a second degree in managing behavior, but also in implementing evidence-based teaching strategies, right? And so that's something that in higher education we're constantly struggling with, but also thinking about how to embed in our courses. And it has implications for you as as teachers in the field. So these are some of the reasons why instruction sometimes takes a back seat or a back burner in emotional and behavioral disorder classrooms or classrooms for students with EBD. But in this module, we're going to talk through some ways to try to overcome that historical notion, and I challenge each of you to really work hard to become stronger teachers in that regard as it relates to effective teaching, even when you are managing challenging behaviors. So let's review a few effective teaching strategies. And these are all outlined in your chapter 12. I'm not going to go through each of them in a lot of detail because I think the book really does a great job. And so I want you to kind of spend some time underlining those and really gaining a clear understanding of each of these principles. But I do want to speak through each of them. And my goal I know this is not helpful for you all, but for the next class is to develop a module that is more interactive so we can actually practice some of these strategies. It's just a little difficult to do in this sort of setting, but I'm hoping that you're able to catch on to some of these. And I imagine that many of you, especially those of you who are already in the classroom, you are probably familiar with many of these strategies. So just think about ways that you might adapt them just a little bit to better meet the needs of students who may be struggling with behavior. So the first one is to maximize academic engaged time, and it's literally just what it says. You really want to spend as much time as possible keeping your students engaged in specific tasks. And I'm sure you can imagine why this is important. For students who have emotional behavioral disorders, if they are not engaged, they are often finding themselves in trouble, whether that is with peers or, anxiety, if in those quiet moments, or if they're not engaged in a specific activity, they may find themselves being ridden by anxiety or anxiety producing thoughts. And contrary to that, however, we know that the more time students spend actively engaged, the better their learning outcomes. So if you're able to embed strategies such as pre-teaching your content, so you're giving students an early opportunity to be exposed to the content that you'll be teaching for that day. If you're maximizing their engagement, so you're giving them opportunities to raise their hand, you're giving them opportunities to contribute to the classroom culture and the classroom environment. You're giving them opportunities to demonstrate their knowledge, then you're maximizing their engagement. You also want to use your time efficiently. So you want to manage your time during classroom instruction so that students can not only demonstrate their knowledge, but that they don't get frustrated when, they may be struggling. So you want to really manage that classroom time. You also want to think more about your classroom management. We talked about this in one of our previous modules, and we know that teachers with poor classroom management tend to spend excessive amounts of time disciplining students, and then you find that you're not able to be as engaged in effective instruction. And finally, you want to utilize your reinforcement systems. You guys probably have noticed by now, I sent some feedback for your last reflections about how reinforcement and especially token economy systems are probably my favorite behavioral strategy to use in the classroom because they're so effective. And an effective way to increase this engaged time is simply to reinforce your students. So when they're responding to questions, when they look engaged, when they are, completing assignments as requested, or even if they're following simple classroom rules. For some students, you really have to start that reinforcement at a really basic level. If you have a student who can't come into your classroom without cursing everyone out on the way in, and then over time they're able to walk in quietly, put their backpack away, or whatever they need to unpack for their day, you want to start reinforcing even those small steps and those small victories, because they are just that, they are victories. In those ways, you're able to maximize a student's engaged time because you're reducing the amount of time that you're having to manage behavior. So it seems like we're still talking about behavior, and we are, because the more you're able to proactively manage those behavioral issues, the more time you're able to spend engaged in academic content and academic instruction. You also want to provide a space that ensures high rates of correct academic responding. So another thing that is extremely frustrating, particularly for students with EBD, you also see this in students with emotional behavior, with autism, and in students with intellectual disability, is that it can be very frustrating when they aren't able to get correct answers, or when they don't understand the content. And if you have an expectation that they produce a correct response and they haven't yet mastered the content, that really becomes a challenge and a problem. So you want to provide a sufficient number of opportunities for your students to respond and to give feedback and to reflect on their responses. You also want to contrive opportunities that allow for correct responses. So this means that if it's a novel concept, you're not going to ask one of your students to give you the response before you've even pre-taught or modeled or provided feedback, right? But you will have it, however, want to contrive opportunities where you know that your student has already mastered that content, and that if you ask them, Johnson, what is 8 times 4? He knows that answer. You don't want to ask Johnson 8 times 4 when you know that he has not yet mastered single-digit multiplication, okay? So you want to make sure that you are in the correct sort of space to provide positive feedback and allow your students to have correct responses. Along with that, you want to model and give verbal praise and provide corrective feedback when the students are off a bit. So you want to make sure that corrective feedback is provided in a responsive way to meet your students' needs. And then ongoing, you want to make sure that you're monitoring your student responding so that you can address that as you move forward. The next principle is to think about how to maximize the amount of content that you cover. And this is super important because one of the issues we think about kind of these accountability measures for you as teachers. And if you aren't covering the content, then there's a mismatch between your students' outcome and performance when you aren't able to get through the content in the classroom. And so you want to have increased opportunities for students to learn the content because, as we mentioned, this simply increases student achievement. And so in in your chapter, the Mastropori and Scruggs, they are really well known in the field, and I can still never say the M word, M researcher's name, but they've done a lot of work around EBD. And so they've talked specifically about how teachers cover the amount of content that teachers cover during the year is determined by factors such as state standards, the curriculum guides, and the length of the school year. However, these factors only reflect opportunities to cover content. And what we want to think more about is how to increase the amount of time you have to cover the content while also being responsive to these standards. So one of the things that you want to do is determine an appropriate scope. So what information will I teach, right? And then an appropriate sequence. In what order will I teach this information? And these pieces are very important because it helps you to structure the content that you'll provide as you go throughout. And then finally, you want to monitor your pace of progression. So you really want to reflect on at what pace you're moving through your content. And if you see that you're halfway through the year, but you're only a quarter way through the content that you should be, then you definitely need to pick up the pace and think about ways to make adjustments in that regard. If you'd like to take a break, feel free to do so here. This is a pretty brief lecture, so we'll be finished with the rest of it in the next 15 minutes. So principles of effective instruction continued. We're next going to talk about principle 4, which is matching assignments to student ability. So we know that when assignments are too difficult, it leads to challenging behavior. We also know that when assignments are too difficult, it leads to less on-task behavior. And that pretty much makes sense. If students don't know how to do it, and if it's too difficult for them, then they find other ways to engage, right? And so as a teacher, you want to make sure that you are matching your students' learning tasks to their ability levels. And this is where it's important to think about that differentiation and that individualized instruction. And this is why we have IEPs, right? Because each student's learning needs are different. And you want to make sure that you are incorporating instruction in a way that meets their needs. So you might be adapting worksheets for, you might have one worksheet for the majority of your class, and then you might have 3 additional versions of that same worksheet that you have adapted for some students in your class who may need additional support. And that's because you want those students to also be successful in targeting or in mastering a particular skill or content, but you're making it more accessible for them at their current learning level. So that part is super important. You might also be incorporating things like task analyses. So even simple checklists, again, going back to the example for coming into the classroom, it can be a checklist for how to complete a particular math problem. It can be a checklist for thinking through the, if it's an activity though in science, if there's something that has multiple steps, right? So you really want to think about ways to incorporate task analyses so that both you and your student understand how to break down tasks into smaller pieces and how to complete those tasks when you assign them. The next principle is teaching academic content explicitly. And this, again, is super important because when teachers are able to teach the content explicitly, they are, demonstrating skills, they're explaining concepts, they're giving opportunities for practice, and then they're reviewing that concept and the content and kind of going back in that cycle for the next skill. So a quote from your book says that it defines explicit teaching as a systematic method of teaching with an emphasis on proceeding in small steps, checking for student understanding, and achieving active and successful participation by all students. So when you walk into those classrooms and teachers are modeling, right? And then they explain the concept And then you give opportunities for practice. So your students break away into small groups, and then they come back and they give responses and feedback about those particular problems or assignments, and then you review it all together. Those are examples of explicit instruction. And you really want to see that cycle of modeling, explanation, opportunities for practice or engagement, and then that review, because that is really what helps our students to not only understand, but to reflect or demonstrate their understanding of learned content. Okay, so having a measure of that. So take a quick look at the way this teacher uses catch and release as an explicit instruction strategy in her classroom. And when you're back, let's talk a little bit about scaffolded student instruction as another principle of effective instruction. So scaffolded instruction is again, tongue-tied all day, instructional strategy that provides students with needed support while they are learning. So I think your book gave the example of like when painters or construction workers are building and how they use those scaffolds. It's literally the same sort of thought process. You're providing your students with the support they need to make it to the next step. And then as you get there, you can start to think about ways to remove those supports. So teachers can teach most effectively when they're increasing opportunities for students to learn, but while also decreasing those opportunities for error. So errorless teaching is very important, again, specifically for students with EBD, because when they're able to learn errorlessly, there's more reinforcement, there's less frustration, and there's more engagement in the classroom. So you can think about using prompting strategies as ways to scaffold the instruction as you go throughout. So some of the prompting strategies that we often refer to include antecedent prompts. So this antecedent, as you know, you're familiar with that from your ABC charts, are embedded before a particular activity. So you might also hear this referred to as like priming. And so with this, you prompt the students during instruction, and then you provide practice or testing activities after removing the prompts, okay? And so the next one is most to least prompting, and essentially you're just decreasing the assistance to students over time. So you want to provide the most intrusive prompts at first, so you might be literally giving them the answer, and then over time, let's say it's a multiplication problem, you're only giving them part of the answer, and eventually you're fading those prompts, so it's most to least. Sometimes we start with least to most prompting. Least to most prompting is most useful when you're pretty sure the student has already mastered the concept, but maybe they've forgotten it, maybe it's been over a break, or if they're having a particularly challenging day overall and you don't want to agitate them, perhaps you'll use least prompting first, and then if they're still struggling, provide them with more prompting. And then finally, you have antecedent prompt and fade. And so with the antecedent prompt and fade strategy, you're really hoping to provide the more intrusive prompts at first, and then you're fading those out in a systematic manner. So those are kind of similar to the least to most prompting, except for least to most, you're increasing the assistance when the student doesn't provide the behavior or the expected outcome related to the content. Some other strategies for scaffolded instruction include study guides, organizers, outlines, things like that. Things that help your students get to where they need to be. So always think about that, building scenario and how that parallels to scaffolded instruction in the classroom. So feel free to visit the IRIS module for more discussion and explanation on scaffolded instruction. You can click here for the link to that website to learn more about scaffolding instruction. Another principle is to use direct instruction. And there are a number of principles related to direct instruction, and we know that it has been shown to be effective with students with diverse learning needs. And teachers are critically responsible for student learning and curriculum design as it relates to student achievement. So the goal then of direct instruction is to accelerate student learning via these specific instructional design and delivery strategies. So some of those strategies include instructional grouping, so thinking about how you group your students based on learning needs. You also think about academic engaged time. So what percentage of your time are students directly engaged with learning materials? And then scripted presentation. This is where things differ quite a bit because you're actually using scripted programs. And one of the things that is useful is that you don't necessarily have to think so much through, giving the explanations and the demonstrations because they're already designed and developed for you. So that's the nice part. But you have to think about fidelity of implementation with direct instruction. So that means to what extent are you implementing the instruction as it is designed, okay? So are you engaging your students in choral responding? Are you using rapid pacing as you go throughout? And are you implementing or including strategies for continuous assessment? So direct instruction, again, is important. And I think there are two different, kind of views in the field about direct instruction and its usefulness. I think in terms of the research, it has a very strong evidence base. Personally, I think it's really effective for young teachers or new teachers or newer teachers to the field because it really has a clear and direct model for how to work through your instruction. And then you can sort of borrow some of those techniques as you kind of drift away from that direct instruction. But direct instruction is especially effective for students with particular learning needs. So you want to keep that in mind as well. So here is a quick video that it gives an idea of how to facilitate direct instruction via your classroom setup. And so what can you embed in your classroom environment? How can you set up your classroom environment to facilitate better direct instruction? And finally, you want to monitor your student progress. So effective teaching requires the ongoing evaluation of student performance. And you want to use progress monitoring as a formative and ongoing strategy. And you don't want to wait until after a particular program or content standard has been implemented, but you want your students to be able to demonstrate that mastery and those general outcomes along the way. So making sure that you give your students opportunities to demonstrate that, whether it's raising hands in class to provide verbal responses or choral responses, or if you're using quick quizzes at the end of a content, that you're measuring those outcomes along the way, because those formative evaluation outcomes will in some cases differ from your general